Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel. Today's review is going to be a little bit different than normal. Normally I download a game that I've never heard of because honestly, most indie games I've probably never heard of. But this game, Kamiko or Kimiko, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I had actually heard a few people compare to the early Legend of Zelda games. Now, having been alive for at least a few years in the 80s, I actually was exposed to the original releases of games like Legend of Zelda, Secret of Mana, and a few other pixel art games where you'd navigate around the map, solving puzzles and unlocking things to eventually figure out the overarching storyline. So needless to say, I had some high hopes for Kamiko. The game is rendered very well, and I think that's one of its most common praises is in its pixel art. But even though the graphics and the character select screen and the initial introduction did have me going as far as the art went, I couldn't quite get past the translation for the Old English. Using thou instead of thee and thine instead of thy. Funny enough, I actually do have a degree in linguistics, so while the misuse of Old English didn't actually break up the gameplay per se, it did kind of draw me out of the realism of the scenario. I mean, if you are going to be using a dialect to set the mood of a game, you should probably try to use it the right way. The gameplay in Kamiko is actually really straightforward. Much like the early Zelda games, and probably the reason for most of the references, is that you generally navigate around a somewhat larger map, attempting to find hidden switches and secret buttons to push to open gates. After 4 gates are opened in each level, you're able to then proceed and fight the boss. In each level there are stat boosting items available, but if you didn't actually manage to find them in the level, before you fight each boss there are actually stat boosting items directly outside the door. One to boost power and one to boost health. Now in my initial playthrough I didn't realize that's what they were, I thought they were just refills, and since when I went into the boss room both of my bars were full, I actually defeated the boss and lost out on improving my overall health and power statistics. While I wouldn't normally lean toward a superimposed tutorial, it's elements like this that actually do need to be introduced to a player. Eventually in the game, having a heightened stamina bar and heightened health really will affect the gameplay and how you make it through certain bosses. So having been aware of this in the beginning, I would have actively sought out these items and definitely would have grabbed them when they were just right there for me before a boss. The boss fights in Kamiko are another element that are really stereotypical of the kind of open adventure games from the early 90s and late 80s. And that is that they have a general attack pattern that is very well telegraphed, allowing you to know where the damage areas might be and how to avoid them. Other than that, the 3-hit system for a boss kill stays true. Overall, if you've figured out how to use your charged move and your standard attacks with your character, the boss fights really aren't that difficult. And in all honesty, the entire game really isn't that difficult. I think most people could probably finish the game in about an hour. The music in Kamiko is actually pretty well done. I gotta give them props for the audio as well as the simplicity of the character controls. Those along with the true pixel art style graphics really do have a nostalgic feel for a player, and I think that it's that sense of nostalgia they were going for the most. Because the story is a little bit light and there really isn't a lot to tie a player into replay value. Though there are 3 characters to choose from and each of those characters does have uniquely different attacks, such as close combat, ranged combat, or a decent mix of both. Despite this slight level of variety, everything else in the levels will stay the same. They're not procedurally generated, so the boss's attack patterns and even where the mobs spawn within the level will always be the same. Though if you're a fan of trying to do speedruns through these open adventure games, that actually might be a positive thing for it. There are only 5 worlds to unlock with 5 predictable bosses to fight, so if you really tried, you probably could own this game in about half an hour. Though I think for the average player, 1 playthrough is probably going to be enough. Despite Kamiko being about a 1-hour game for the average player, overall it's really not that bad. I'd have to say it's pretty decent, especially for the price. But there is one specific element that I'd like to point out that just might rub a player the wrong way. And that's the fact that while, like those early adventure games like Zelda did have mobs that would spawn and pop up as you walked into an area, most likely to account for load times in those early game days, Kamiko has the mobs pop up, but they pop up directly where you are. So as you go from room to room, the mobs are popping up at the rate of your progression, meaning that as you engage in the room to the point where the mobs would spawn, you're generally at that point on top of them. And as it is a touch damage system, that means unless you're expecting the mobs to be there, say your second or third playthrough, there's really no way to avoid them. Though if you really consider it, I can see why the game developers may have done this. And that is because the actual puzzle element of the game. Though this is an open adventure game devoted to melee combat, the puzzle elements require you to carry certain items to their destination. It's during this phase that you're both unable to run and unable to attack, meaning the only way to make it to your destination is to just simply avoid these rapidly spawning enemies. The predictability of their spawn patterns and spawn rates does help in this manner, but my thinking is the developer actually thought that having them spawn so quickly would add a level of difficulty during the actual puzzle phase. Otherwise, you could just kill them all and walk to the destination with your key or orb. However, increasing the difficulty level of a certain portion of the game shouldn't increase the frustration of the player. If the mobs would spawn even a half second earlier, you would have a more engaging style of combat and possibly be able to navigate through the puzzles without accidentally having a mob spawn under you and cause you to start over from the beginning. But as I stated before, honestly, the more you play the game, the more intuitive it becomes where the mobs are actually going to spawn. And as the game was likely made to have full replay for each of the characters, so if you look at it that way, it's not really a mistake as much as possibly just a poor choice for the casual player. Someone who's devoted to the genre and wants to go through multiple times, maybe a completionist or a speedrunner, those types of players wouldn't have any problem with that dynamic of the game, I'm sure. Overall, it is a decent game for the price, but if you're going to compare it to Zelda, just don't. It's not going to live up to that expectation. And a seasoned player will beat this game in under an hour. So if you're just looking for something to play casually, or you're just excited to see a new take on an open adventure genre, you might enjoy this one. Well, that wraps up the review of Kamiko for the Nintendo Switch, and I hope it didn't burst anybody's bubble and shatter their dreams of this being a new Zelda game, but honestly, I really wouldn't want to dissuade anyone from trying it. I just want you to know what you're getting into. It's a fun but short open adventure game. Anyway, if you found this review helpful or at least entertaining, feel free to throw me a like, and don't forget to subscribe for the latest updates. These videos are coming out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so check back often or click that little bell if you want to get notified as soon as they hit YouTube. Anyway, this has been Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.